I usually try to avoid politics in my videos and essays because things change so rapidly these days, and the slant from all media sides distorts so much of what can be proven that it makes it very time-consuming to sort out fact from fiction. However, that being said, I will take some time to try and sort out what really happened in Ukraine beginning in early 2013 through 2014 that makes Putin think he was justified to attack that country. I only do this since an online friend accused me of falling for Western propaganda as it relates to the events surrounding this catastrophic war that has cost hundreds of thousands of lives over the last decade on both sides. A war that wasn't necessary except for political and territorial gain reminiscent of the old Soviet Union days, of which I am more than old enough to have lived through its beginning after World War II until December 1991. Also, to charge the West with propaganda, which they are very capable of performing for its own benefit, and not lay the same charge on KGB operative and current president of Russia. Vladimir Putin of the same is neglectful at best and dishonest and disingenuous at worst. So, then let's look at the facts as best as we can sort them out and the backstory of all that has taken place to this point in that horrific operation. In late 2013, the very pro-Russian, pro-Moscow president of Ukraine was a man named Viktor Yanukovych. He totally rejected any association agreement with the EU in favor of closer ties with Russia. However, most Ukrainians, especially those residing in the west and central regions of Ukraine, which were the majority of the nation's population, poured into the streets in protest demanding a European future. Months of protests, known as the Maidan Revolution, eventually escalated into violence, leading to what could have been an internal civil war, and Yanukovych fled to Russia by February 2014. Once the dust settled, what came out of the revolution was a new, Western-leaning interim government. Putin immediately called this an illegal coup, claiming the West engineered it, leading to his annexation of Crimea by March 2014. Putin sent in what became known as his Little Green Men, which were unmarked Russian soldiers. His annexation of Crimea was not a difficult task since most living there are a Russian-speaking majority, and Russia has a key Black Sea naval base at Sevastopol. The Crimean government put in a rushed referendum, to this day not recognized internationally, which showed support for joining Russia. Once Crimea was in his hip pocket, Putin then set his sights on eastern Ukraine with the war in Donbass. This area of Ukraine was dominated by mostly Russian-speaking Ukrainians with pro-Russian separatists, backed by Moscow, declaring the People's Republics in Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia supplied these separatists with weapons, fighters, and intelligence. The conflict has simmered since then, with about 14,000 killed even before the full 2022 invasion. So then, what were Putin's claims and justifications for attacking full-scale in 2022? Over time, his reasoning has shifted back and forth, but basically he justifies the war against another sovereign nation for the following reasons. Geopolitical paranoia. He saw Ukraine moving toward the EU and NATO as an existential threat to Russian influence. Narrative of betrayal. He argues the West stole Ukraine through a coup, undermining Russia's historical and cultural ties. Protecting Russians. He frames himself as defending ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine, especially in Crimea and Donbass. Great power mindset. Putin has repeatedly said Ukraine is not a real state and should be within Russia's sphere of control. Soviet Union anybody? So, from Moscow's perspective, 2014 was the moment Ukraine slipped away into the Western camp. Putin considered the new government illegitimate, and Crimea Donbass were his way of both punishing Ukraine and securing Russia's strategic interests. However, from Ukraine's and the West's perspective, 2014 was a democratic uprising, and Russia's aggression started then, not in 2022. How did Putin frame the 2014 Ukrainian revolution to his own people to get them solidly behind his war footing? First and foremost, the Russian state TV and media never called it the Maidan Revolution or even legitimate protests. Instead, it was always framed as a CIA-backed coup d'etat. The official story was framed as the US and EU funded radicals to overthrow a democratically elected president, Yanukovych. Therefore, the new government in Kyiv was declared illegitimate from the start. As that scenario began to wane, the propaganda moved on to the Nazi label. Putin's media focused heavily on far-right Ukrainian groups that were present at Maidan, such as the Right Sector. While these radical right groups were small in number, Russian propaganda inflated them into the face of the revolution. Sounds very familiar with what the left in America tried to do a few years back with Charlottesville. They pushed the idea that fascists had taken over Ukraine, triggering Russian memories of World War II and the Great Patriotic War. That's where Putin's whole denazification rhetoric later came from. It didn't start in 2022, but actually was seeded in 2014. Of course, what followed was his protecting our people rhetoric. Crimea and Donbass were portrayed as filled with ethnic Russians in danger from Ukrainian Nazis. Russian media broadcasted endless stories of Russian speakers being persecuted and even fabricated atrocities. This laid the groundwork for "we're not invading, we're rescuing." The idea from Putin and his cronies that it is really the West and the United States and NATO that are the puppet masters took a hold of the Russian public. The narrative that was and is still being spun: Ukraine isn't really independent. It's controlled by Washington, Brussels, and NATO. So, in Putin's paranoid delusion, the fight wasn't just against Ukraine, it was against Western encroachment on Russia's borders. This mindset taps into deep Russian fears of being surrounded and encircled. The annexation of Crimea was framed as restoring historical justice. Russian TV showed cheering crowds, framed it as overwhelmingly popular while ignoring the rushed, military-controlled referendum. Putin's approval rating shot through the roof, embedding him even more. This was his nationalist victory lap. Why does any of this historian backstory matter? By 2014, Putin had basically rewritten the story for his justification to the Russian people and his allies. Ukraine equals Nazi, a Western puppet state. Russia equals protector of the people, defender of World War II's legacy, victim of Western aggression. This set the stage for 8 years of simmering conflict, and it's exactly the propaganda he revived in 2022 for launching the full-scale war. Therefore, in his own mind, and in the minds of many Russians, Putin wasn't invading Ukraine. He was finishing what he started in 2014, saving Ukraine from Nazis and the West. The next question we are forced to confront is why the majority of the Russian people bought Putin's 2014 narrative. First of all, we in the West have to be aware of the World War II trauma the Russian people experienced is a sacred myth. In Russia, World War II, the Great Patriotic War, isn't just history, it's national identity. 27 million Soviets died fighting actual German Nazis, and that memory is seared in their minds as being nearly sacred. By branding Ukrainians as fascists, Putin activated the deepest collective memory. For many of the Russian people, anyone against Russia is seen as Nazi or Nazi-like, so that anyone Russia opposes is seen as being justified. Think of it as a Nazi button. Putin, a master at psychological manipulation thanks to his years in the KGB, can press any time to rally unity. Even though the Soviet Union disappeared 34 years ago, that Soviet-era suspicion of the West still remains in many Russians. The Cold War taught generations that the West is always plotting to weaken Russia, and with NATO's continued expansion since 1991, it has understandably fed right into this paranoia. So when Russian TV screamed, "The CIA is behind Maidan," it didn't sound crazy, it sounded familiar. Vladimir Putin has been Russia's president now for 13 years as of 2025. By 2014, he had already consolidated nearly all Russian TV and media under state control. Independent voices were small, online, and easily labeled as foreign agents. For most Russians, the state's story was the story. And at that time, TV and print media still had way more power than online media. For example, when Putin annexed Crimea, his approval ratings skyrocketed from around 60% to over 85%. Why? Because he gave Russians a victory they hadn't felt since the Soviet collapse all those decades earlier. The 1990s were humiliating. Crimea felt like revenge on history. In my opinion, it was this Crimea high that made the Russian people trust everything else he said. It was their feel-good drug. Also, the ever-gnawing fear in the minds of Russians when they saw the chaos in Kyiv during Maidan may have made them think that could happen here. Putin framed himself as the strong man preventing Russia from collapsing like Ukraine. He became the stalwart of stability, which may mean a cost to some personal freedom, a trade most Russians accepted. Let's face it, real freedom experienced by most in the West, particularly in the United States, is not the go-to for many in the former Soviet Union. The West greatly failed as well, whether out of ignorance or on purpose, we may never know. The West's counter-narrative flopped big time. Western media said, Ukraine had a democratic revolution. Russia is the aggressor. Inside Russia, this didn't land at all because, number one, it conflicted with state media's Nazis took over narrative. Very few Russians had direct access to Western media, and when they did, they often distrusted it as propaganda too, just like my online friend does to this day, even though he is quite broad-minded and intelligent on so many other aspects of what is taking place in the world. Here's the kicker. By 2014, Putin had created an alternate reality bubble. Inside Russia, people didn't see their country invading anyone. Right or wrong, they saw a defensive war against Nazis, chaos, and Western meddling. Okay, now we have tried to see this war and its backstory through the lens of Putin and the Russian people. Now it's time to pull the curtain back and try to see it from the Ukrainian and Western perspective. All right, let's flip the lens and stand in Kyiv's shoes for a moment. Because while Putin was spinning the Nazi coup fairy tale, Ukraine was experiencing something very different. And honestly, it explains why they've fought so fiercely since. First, we have to start where it began again in 2014 and Ukraine's perspective. They see Maidan as a rebirth, not a coup. To Ukrainians, the Euromaidan protests weren't a CIA op, they were a grassroots revolution led by young, urban, middle-class people sick of corruption and Russia's tight grip. It was about choosing Europe over Putin's orbit. They call it the revolution of dignity. The majority of Ukrainians saw their president Yanukovych as nothing more than a Kremlin puppet, and the fact that he fled to Moscow may lend real credence to that idea. Ukrainians saw Yanukovych as selling out their future by rejecting the EU deal. When he fled to Russia, it only confirmed suspicions that he was Moscow's man, not Kyiv's. So for them, replacing him wasn't a coup. It was taking back their dignity and sovereignty. For most Ukrainians, the annexation of Crimea was a gut punch. One day, Russian troops were doing exercises. The next day, the peninsula was gone. Ukrainians saw it as a land grab, pure theft, plain and simple. Many Crimean Tatars, a Muslim minority, and pro-Kiev Ukrainians fled and still call it an occupation, not a reunion, to use Putin's word for it. Ukrainians viewed the separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk not as freedom fighters, but as Russian proxies. Moscow was handing out weapons, propaganda, and even soldiers. For Ukraine, this was the actual beginning of the war, not 2022. Over 14,000 dead between 2014 through 2021 was proof this wasn't just a local uprising. Now here's the big one. 2014 changed Ukraine's self-perception. Before this time, Ukraine was kind of split. East leaning toward Russia, West leaning toward Europe. However, after Crimea and Donbass, huge numbers of Ukrainians who once felt ambivalent turned against Moscow. Russian speakers in Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa started saying, "We may speak Russian, but we are Ukrainian." For them, Putin's aggression backfired. Instead, it forged a stronger Ukrainian identity than ever before. The view of the West in the US, NATO, and the EU became very supportive of Ukraine's fight for sovereignty. But during the Biden administration, Ukrainians saw Europe and the US as imperfect allies, supportive with words, sanctions, and aid, but hesitant to confront Russia directly. NATO membership became a dream for many, precisely because of Russia's behavior in 2014. To Ukrainians, Putin's actions proved the West wasn't the ones meddling. Russia was. Here's the bottom line when it comes to the Ukrainian perspective on all that has taken place beginning back in 2012 through now. For them, 2014 wasn't a coup, it was liberation. Crimea wasn't a homecoming, it was theft. Donbass wasn't civil war, it was invasion. And instead of scaring Ukraine back into Russia's orbit, Putin accidentally forged a united, determined anti-Russian Ukraine under the leadership of a one-time actor, comedian, and Ukrainian Jew named Volodymyr Zelenskyy. So now we have the full arc now, Putin's story versus Ukraine's story, two totally different realities colliding with the rest of the world caught in the middle. How will it turn out? Time will tell. Thanks for staying until the end. Until next time, this is Shmuel ben Shlomi wishing you shalom. Like, subscribe, share.